Hello everyone! Today I'm going to be featuring the Napoli, Tier 10 premium cruiser, or well, kinda almost battle cruiser, Italian, armed with 254mm guns. It's quite chunky as well, sitting at 59.2k health, but first of all we're gonna talk a bit about the armor model. It does have an icebreaker. Don't ask me why a Mediterranean ship has an icebreaker, but it is quite small, or maybe it's more accurate to say that the tip of the nose is a huge chunk of 25mm of plating. So you want to be extremely careful when you angle this, because well, your upper belt and your deck armor is actually quite good. You're sitting at 60mm upper belt and 40mm deck armor, so you can bounce the majority of AP. But this nose vulnerability means that, well, you see the way I'm trying to angle here. I'm trying to make sure these Ohio shells are hitting my upper belt and hitting my deck armor, because if you go perfectly nose in, there's only one thing for him to shoot: the nose, and he's going to be dealing a ton, well, as you can see, a ton of damage. He basically gets full pins every time he hits that nose, so you want to avoid it at all costs. The Napoli, of course, is kind of the special ship in terms. It's the reason why the Eger was killed. It is supposed to be a secondary cruiser. That is how it's marketed, and it does have some incredibly accurate secondaries compared to many of the other cruisers, and unlike the other cruisers, it also shoots SAP. Now, the range isn't actually anything special on the secondaries. It's 7.3. I don't know why I've seen so many people talk about this being amazing range. It's literally standard. Des Moines has the same secondary range. There's nothing special about it. But I have multiple issues with these SAP secondaries, and well, I'll get into them in more detail as we go on. But let's talk more about the armor detail itself, because while the bow is tanky, the stern is not. The stern has significant issues. Even if you look at it, even without the armor viewer up, you can tell that there's basically this big flat box on the stern, as well as this, well, this step. And if you actually look at the armor, it becomes even worse, because, well, the entire stern is overmatchable, and the top of the stern, or well, this back part, this back plate, is basically guaranteed to arm almost all shells coming your way. So trying to angle away in the Napoli, trying to kite away, is very frustrating. The firing angles are quite poor, and more importantly, this stern is immensely vulnerable. I've gotten Citadel through this stern, I've eaten 10,000 even from IOVAs and such while I'm kiting away. Because this stern basically makes sure all the shells that land are fully armed and do full penetration damage. And this can be extremely frustrating, because even if you maneuver and you react in time, this still gets you punished. An in-game practical example of this is, I'm pushing up, chasing an RPF destroyer, I get spotted, I know the enemy has a Thunder in their spawn, I instantly start turning away before he even shoots, and I am fully angled by the time the shells land, and I still get citadeled straight through the stern, because I overmatched it and basically shaved off a huge chunk of my health. And it doesn't have to be a Thunder, because it's 25mm plating, so basically any battleship can do the same. Keep in mind that citadels hurt the Napoli extra much, because it only heals 10% of citadel damage, which is, well, not a lot. If you do want to basically utilize your armor, or if you're angling away, you kind of want to be doing what I'm doing here, and that is trying to bait the shells. Well, ideally you want to be undetected. In this case I'm using my own smoke, but you kind of want to try to bait the shells on that upper belt and on that deck armor. You want to avoid getting shot on the stern, because, well, you get chunked so very hard. Also, you can't give full broadside in this thing. It has a turtleback, and it actually has 30mm of plating, which, of course, something like an Ohio can easily overmatch. In fact, there's quite a lot of battleships that can overmatch it, but I wouldn't trust that turtleback too much. In fact, I've been able to citadel other Napolis, and I've gotten citadel through it quite consistently, so I don't think the turtleback actually is very effective. It's just another layer of extra armor. However, if you're playing at, I would say, a medium range or a long range, and you're able to juke shells in such a way that they can't hit your stern, well, you can see that the armor is actually quite effective, and Ohio didn't really manage to deal any damage to me. Next up, we have the secondaries. Now, what you have here below you is a test it is Napoli with full secondary build, except the 3 million module, and it is Pensacola, also with a full secondary build. Yeah, I'm not gonna spoil who the winner is, but I quickly identified a lot of issues with Napoli's secondaries. While the dispersion is, well, it is good for a cruiser, but it has multiple issues. The main one really being is that it's SAP, semi-armor piercing, which means that it's only really useful if someone gives you flat broadside. Well, not flat, but a lot of broadside. If someone angles in, like, well, this bot Kleber's stationary does, well, you'll find out that, well, your damage is completely non-existent, and even a secondary Pensacola is actually more effective at killing destroyers than you are. From the same range, even though you started shooting earlier. And Pensacola got pretty unlucky, only getting one fire. And this is quite evident in gameplay as well. Namely, I'm pushing into a cap, as you would kinda expect me to do in a tanky, well-concealed cruiser as I am, and the enemy has a Riga. Now, the Riga nose is 25mm, so it's something that I should be able to deal a lot of damage to, considering my big caliber secondaries pen 42mm, and the ones that shoot a lot more often pen 26mm. But here we come to one of the key issues with having SAP secondaries. Namely, if the target just angles straight in towards you, the secondaries actually don't do a whole lot. And the big issue here really is that the reason why you like secondary builds, well, the reason why people run secondary builds is really to deal with these nose-in targets. Because, well, if someone is giving broadside, your guns do the work. But if someone is angled, that's when you want secondaries. German secondaries have high pen HE, so you just deal a lot of damage to nose-in targets with those. On the other hand, American secondaries start a lot of fires. They have poor pen, but they have really good fire starting capacity. So they also deal well with nose-in targets. The Germans just do raw damage, and the Americans start a lot of fires. This is really the core concept of secondaries. When you're pushing in and fighting someone and they angle against you, you want your secondaries to be able to, well, help you deal damage in this case. But, well, you can see I'm below 10,000 damage with my 54 secondary hits, and the vast majority of my great SAP shells that are supposed to do so much damage, well, they're not actually doing a whole lot. And this is fully invested into secondaries, as much invested as I possibly could be, but if someone decides to angle against these SAP secondaries, well, I'm just basically shit out of luck. Don't get me wrong, I still think that the secondaries, well, they can be useful, but they're just not as useful as American or German secondaries. The only thing they really have going for them is, well, the dispersion. The range is very much standard, and of course, well, if you do get to farm broadsides, the DPM is good because it's SAP, but most of the time you're not really getting the value out of them. This is a Champagne, a very squishy tier 8 battleship, and this is just my secondaries raining down on him. And I think he's got a fire ticking on him, but you can look at I popped a smoke when I'm done 73,000 damage. And this is a full smoke duration, and this one, no, keep in mind, this is very much full secondary build. This is the 3 million module. Instead of dispersion, we're building secondaries. This is running top grade gunner, which gives you 10% secondary reload. This is even running the 3 million module that reduces your reload by 20%. But if someone just doesn't, well, give you flat squishy broadsides, which then your secondaries, well, we did about maybe 10,000 damage. It's not bad. I mean, it's kind of free damage considering we were in a smoke, but considering how much gunpowder you give up to achieve this, it feels rather underwhelming. And especially if someone goes nose in and you're not doing a whole lot, it feels, well, kind of even worse than that. I did mention that you have to give up a fair few things, and well, there's quite a bit of them. First of all, your default range is 16.3, which isn't exactly impressive at tier 10. Your HE is very anemic, not just the 17-second reload, but also you have a 16% fire chance, which for these huge 254mm guns isn't exactly impressive. The other issue is that you don't really have standard dispersion. You have Tallinn dispersion, which is basically a bit worse cruiser dispersion, which once again makes life a lot harder for you because, well, you're already struggling with the HE being fairly anemic. The AP, on the other hand, is actually quite nice. You have basically Moskva, roughly Moskva Henry pen, which is very, very good pen to have on this 254s. This means that you can kind of citadel any cruiser across the map. And this has kind of been, well, my adopted playstyle in this ship. I really tried making these secondaries work, but I feel like Wargaming forgot a fair few things when it comes to, well, actually making a ship that can push in and use the secondaries. Well, the first obvious thing is it doesn't have any way to deal with destroyers. In fact, you notice that I've spec'd RPF, and I've literally spec'd RPF simply to have some way of dealing with enemy destroyers. And for something like Venezia, well, if you see a DD, you slap them very, very hard. This thing can't really exactly do the same, but more importantly, the Venezia plays at these long ranges, so it doesn't need it the same way. Whereas the Napoli, well, the ideal Napoli is the one that pushes in and uses its secondaries a lot. You can't really do that in this thing. In fact, every time I've tried to push into a destroyer, I just end up being torped by torpedoes I didn't see coming. The rudder shift is quite poor on the ship. It's something, what, 12.5 seconds? It's actually even worse than Hindenburg's rudder shift. It is quite fast though, but I mean, ultimately you can't really push in without hydro and a very, very poor rudder shift, and you don't have any radar. Basically, you have no way of dealing with destroyers. So trying to push in alone in this thing has been, well, very much an exercise in futility. Even worse is when you're stuck there, the other ship is nose in and suddenly your secondaries don't do any damage. And then you start seeing torps in the water. It's just a very, very frustrating experience to try to push in. And if you have to deal with multiple ships, that nose is quite vulnerable and so forth. So ultimately I scrapped the entire going for secondaries build, and I found a build that works quite well, and I found the ship to be pretty enjoyable. I'm not going to say good, but it works pretty well as a mid-range ship that can push in when the need requires. Because once again, it does have 59.2k health. The AP pen is very, very good. If you have the secondaries kind of as a backup, and you do have your smoke. You only get fighter plane, not spotter plane, sadly, and then you have very good torpedo angles. So there's a fair bit of flexibility you can play around with. Obviously, the idea that this was supposed to be some sort of secondary ship, well, that kind of died for me because it just, well, the secondaries have just too many issues with them. But in terms of build, well, I actually went range mod on it because 16.3 is just garbage when you can't have a spotter plane to increase it. And considering the incredible AP penetration, you can easily citadel ships across the map. Note, the Brindisi is actually close enough to be my smoke firing penalty. It's 8.7, it's better than Venezia, so it's very, very effective. Trying to get some shots in on him as he ducks away. So the build I went for was basically RPF, range mod, better dispersion, completely scrapping the secondaries. And it made me enjoy the ship to some extent. I thought it was an okay ship. I'm not going to call this ship poor. I mean, it's got a lot of health, it's got good AP pen, it's got good torps. The secondaries are pretty okay, but fundamentally what I was of course hoping for was another Eger, secondary Eger, which was one of my favorite ships of all time, but this ship just really doesn't have anything close to that ship. It just doesn't have the power. And even worse are games where you have to deal with carriers because, well, you're stuck with Italian AA and it's 4.6 km range, and it basically does very, very little if the carrier actually wants to kill you. So very much not an enjoyable experience. Basically everything that you need to push, hydro or radar or AA, like all these things, you completely lack. Or consistent damage. You also don't have that because, well, if some goes nose in, your HE fire chance is poor, you can't burn them to death, your secondaries don't do anything to a nose in target, and you're an extremely vulnerable target to both carriers and destroyers. So this means it lacks the tools needed to effectively push in, and most of the time when I tried to use the secondaries, it was a bunch of, well, reversing at the enemy and then having the secondaries fire on them and so forth. It was honestly kind of an anemic experience. Whereas the kind of gameplay that I'm playing now, you know, I'm playing quite close to the enemy. I have a lot of enemy ships near me, but my concealment is great, my armor is good, my AP penetration is excellent, I have a potential smoke to disengage with. Like, there's a lot of things that you can still play around with. But ultimately, if someone asks me, what can this ship do better than a Petropavlovsk? I don't really have an answer for you. because I don't think it does anything better than the Petropavlovsk. And ultimately, if you play it with this style, what does it do better than a Venezia? Well, I'd say you trade a lot of long-range pressure that the Venezia puts in for better pushing power if need be. That's kind of ultimately, I think Venezia is still the better ship of these two. But that's pretty much it. I'm not going to call it a bad ship. I do think in terms of a secondary ship, it's kind of bad. But as a cruiser, I think it's a pretty decent cruiser. I can show you guys the build that I'm actually using and the one that I recommend. Did you still have your secondaries as a backup with this one? You end up with 8 km secondary range, and you still have the SEP secondaries with the improved dispersion. So if someone does give you broadside, like a DD pops up or something, and he actually gives you, well, a lot of broadside, these will still effectively shred him. But it doesn't really invest anything more into the secondaries than very much this. This is it. This is all you get. Anyway, let me show you guys my recommended build for the ship. Alright, as always, let me start off with the modules. Or sorry, the equipment. The upgrade-wise, we have turret and torpedo survival. Note, I didn't actually talk about it, but the torpedoes are located at the very back of the ship and they are very much exposed. I actually don't like this because they are very easy to break, and also if you're in brawling situations, well, the enemy ship gets to sail past you before you can actually deploy the torpedoes, and as I mentioned, this thing can quite easily be citadeled when giving broadside. The turtleback is not reliable at all. It kind of does hamper its brawling capacity and the power of the torpedoes to begin with. Still, you want to keep your turrets and torpedoes alive. Engine room protection. I haven't actually found myself losing engine or rudder much at all. Quite sturdy. Aiming system mod 1 for better dispersion. Propulsion mod, because, well, most of the time you kind of want to be sitting nose in or stern in, and you want to be juking, trying to get those enemy shells to bounce on your very thick deck and upper belt plating, while at all costs avoiding this gigantic nose and this gigantic stern. So prop mod works the best for this very purpose. Concealment, because your concealment is great, 10.3 for a cruiser of this kind of health pool, that is actually very, very good. And finally, extra range, because you can't slot spotter plane and your default range is garbage. Captain build wise, of course, if you have Luigi Sansonetti, he's basically god tier. Note that if you can afford Turtverse, well, actually, you don't really need it. If you run reload mode, then you have like 30-second turret reverse and you kind of need it. But with this build, I felt quite comfortable not running turret reverse. The first thing, of course, is gun feeder. Sansonetti especially has improved. You want to be using both AP and HE. Priority target, followed by adrenaline rush and concealment expert. That's the default 10-point build. After this, well, all the 3 skills are good. It kind of sucks, but all of them are good. Superintendent is super useful because but not only does it give you an extra heal, it also gives you an extra smoke, which is kind of one of your main gimmicks, the crawling Italian smoke. So maybe get that first. At this point, you can choose between survivability and utility in terms of radio location, so you have some idea where that enemy DD is, especially if you're forced to push in. Or alternatively, you can go for top grade gunner, which is actually really good on Napoli because it gives you secondary battery reload time, and when you're pushing in, it gives you 8% main battery reload time. You kind of need both, and you kind of want both, so this skill is just really, really good for the Napoli. Ultimately, which one you choose first is up to you, but I would recommend getting both of them because I felt that they have made my gameplay significantly more comfortable. Flag-wise, well, you can run the fire flags, but sadly your secondaries, of course, don't benefit from them at all, so I generally don't bother. I just build into survivability. Note that the special flag, X-Ray Papa Una 1, is extremely good because you have that speed smoke, the fuel smoke. The extra speed is good because you are a fast cruiser, 37.3, improved heal, reduced fire duration, well, detonation. And, oh yeah, keep in mind to run the secondary flag. It gives you better dispersion and better range and better reload. It basically buffs everything about your secondaries, so really no reason to slot this one on the Napoli. Overall though, I don't think Napoli is a bad ship. but I don't think it's a particularly good one either. Everything it does, kiting away, spamming HE, can be done better in the likes of Goliaths and Hindenburgs. I probably think even Zhao is a better damage dealer than this thing. When it comes to pushing in, well, it doesn't get anywhere close to Petropavlovsk. Petro is tankier, hits harder, brings more utility, has better AA. And if you just, well, in terms of Italian cruisers, I think Venezia still is the superior one. That doesn't mean it's bad, because once again, it's very stealthy, it's fast, it's got a lot of health, and the guns do pack a pretty mean punch. So by no means do I think the Napoli is a bad cruiser, it's just not a very special one. Honestly, the saddest thing about this isn't so much, I'm perfectly okay with the balance, like being kind of middle of the pack, that's not really an issue to me. What does make me sad is that ultimately the whole point of this ship, well, one of the reasons they probably gutted the Eger was to eventually sell this secondary cruiser, but I find the secondaries to be extremely underwhelming, and that is pretty disappointing. Still, that was all for me. I hope you guys enjoyed the review / commentary. As always, please do subscribe to the channel if you enjoy the content. After all, that's one of the reasons that I like making the content. Anyways, I'll talk to you guys later. Thank you for watching.